Hello, welcome to Relatable. This is your host, Teresa Freeman. Today I speak with Bhavna Sharma, VP of People at Sirius XM. Bhavna and I worked together several years ago, and she was kind enough to sit down and chat with me, talk to me about her cool job at Sirius XM and the path that led her there. We also talk about how she's grown to love and be proud of her Southeastern Asian culture. And we have a good laugh over a funny story in which I inadvertently exposed her bits at a wedding reception. You don't want to miss this episode. Welcome to Relatable. Today I'm talking with Bhavna Sharma, who's the VP of People at Sirius XM. So we're excited to have you here today. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, thank you.
And we're also excited to have you in studio. So we'll have this both on YouTube in video format as well as the regular old audio that people are used to using listening to their podcasts. And Bhavna and I have known each other a long time. I want to say
2009, so
yeah.
Whatever that adds up to be. I can't do
I'm horrible at fast math, so hopefully we don't make me do fast math. So a long time, and you're someone that we've kept in touch with just, via LinkedIn and then like kept in touch, I think, just socially. One of the things that I felt like it was so great to have you on is because you've had an interesting path and career, right? And a lot of what we talk about on here is that, like, what is your path to how you got to where you are? And it's never this straight line that's like super direct and easy, right? There's definitely opportunities and crossroads. And so love to talk to you about that. You're someone that is in the world of people and human resources, and that's obviously close to my heart, so we have a lot in common in terms of our interests and everything there. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. Never thought that anyone would be interested in an HR field when I first started, so I'm happy we're here.
Yeah. Maybe we could start, I usually start with your current role, but before we get there, maybe we can start with, what was your degree in? Like, did you know that this was a subject area that you wanted to pursue when you were in college?
No, not at all. I actually didn't even know what HR was when I started college. And I stumbled upon it. But basically, I, always thought I was going to go into an artistic field. My parents were both artists. I got the artist gene. And I was like, I was so interested in fashion and I would draw. And coming from a very South Asian family, it was like, that's a hobby. I was very much put in check right away. It was like, here are your options. You're either going to be an engineer, a lawyer, or a doctor.
Right.
And I was like, none of those sound interesting enough, right?
Yeah.
Or they sound like a lot of years of school. So I started, undeclared. Mm-hmm. And I was always interested in politics. I live in, right outside of Washington, D.C., so politics was very much in sort of our DNA. My dad watched the news all the time. We had a lot of conversations. So I thought, okay, well, maybe there's something there with politics. So eventually I, started out undeclared and, had conversations with people that were in poli-sci major. And it was like, this sounds great. So I went in thinking that originally I was like, all right, maybe I'll be the first female governor of Virginia.
Love it.
Yeah, it was aspirational, and so I went down the path, and eventually was thinking, I had my eyes on law school, so I, interned, with then Governor Allen's campaign, and I got to see sort of the inner workings of the campaign, and I have to say, I was a little disenchanted with politics in general, and sort of like how it isn't truly what your campaign message is and what you say. There's just so much more, and it was fully loaded. And I thought, well, maybe politics isn't the right place, but I'll still go to law school. And then I was like, well, what am I going to do? Like, am I going to be an attorney and fight cases? I got to my third year and I took an employment law class, and I said, this is fun. I was reading constitutional law. I was reading all sorts of ways of interpreting it and practicality at work. And I thought, this is it. So someone mentioned, well, HR.
Right.
I'm like, what is this? And the rest is history. And I immediately changed course. And instead of applying for law school, applied to grad school and went to American University for a master's in HR, and here I am.
Yeah. It's so interesting. Two things you talked about. One, on the politics side, you're the second person that we spoke with that well, I've talked to a couple politicians actually, but someone that was so passionate and wanted to pursue that kind of career, and similarly was very involved and realized that it's such a stress, right, in terms of being able to affect the change that you want and how you have to do it, right? Like it's not just, I want to serve my community or the country. There's so much else that has to go in it. So that's one thing that it's interesting that you also have that experience. And then on the employment law side, not a lot of people know that, I don't think, that when you are in the world of human resources and you do have to start to interpret law, and one of the things that I love about this career is that the variety and the different people you get to work with. So when I was more heavily, when you and I knew each other well, right, I was doing a lot of risk associated work, and I loved working with our employment attorneys, and I felt like that was an area where I was getting educated almost every day. And in fact, you, when we met, it was because of a merger,
Right.
and you at that time were the HR liaison for a really complicated group, right? That was like, I don't know how to quite characterize it.
And 15 years later, we're still struggling to characterize it. Yeah, I mean, and what was interesting was, I intentionally went into, when I made my shift to management consulting, I intentionally said, I want to do something in international HR, because I had never done it, and I've always wanted to sort of keep learning and keep pushing.
Right.
And HR manager is what we called it back then.
Right.
For an emerging markets practice. We were in the Middle East and North Africa. And while before the merger, Bearing Point was very adept to it. They had that practice for years and understood the nuances and weren't trying to fit sort of this like square peg,
Right.
And after the merger, it was just the most misunderstood organization, and it didn't fit in many ways. And it was we were constantly trying to make that work. But it was very different. It was, completely different from federal practice, which was the purpose of the acquisition was to grow the federal practice, and it was obviously very different from commercial, right? So, what do you do with this group? And there was a lot of ER issues, so there were a lot of risk-related issues associated with it, and
Yeah, without giving too much away, there was definitely, given the sensitivity and the risk associated with where these people were and what they were doing, certainly it was foreign to an organization, that we were in terms of the acquiree, and then being able to like there, because of the massive size of where we worked and the structure and the infrastructure and the rules, and is a very conservative organization, so being able to try to tie that. So there were some fascinating employee relations issues that I still to this day remember, and I dealt with a lot. So those were some of the interesting ones. Yeah, hostages, right? Like crazy hostages.
Hostage situation. We've had a few people that were killed.
Right.
There were we had one that was sexual.
Right.
Assault,
Right.
but just things. And I remember my last interview that I ever did for work, because I've been here now for 5 years. They asked me, so let's talk about employee relations. Tell us your experience. And I said, where do I begin? Do you want to know about the hostage story? So it was.
I remember when I interviewed at Amazon, they asked me a question about, tell me about, a difficult time that had like significant impact, right, and what you had to do. And I told, not related to emerging markets, another story, we had to airlift somebody out of a country where there were international laws that inhibited where we could take this person, and it was literally life or death, and this person was on life support, and all these things that were going to happen, whether they could really effectively evacuate him. The family was in another country, right? It was very complicated. The person interviewing me was like, is there something a little more like, right, like, you know, mainstream, yeah, like, because these experiences are so unusual. It's great to have an interview
and
at
very
the same time.
unrelatable.
Yeah, exactly, unrelatable for sure. Let's talk about your current role and what you're doing now, and because I think Sirius XM is kind of a sexy name and company, and people always think of Howard Stern, right, and other programs that are based out of that. So tell me a little bit about your experience there, how you got that job. I think people might be interested in what that interview process was like for you, and then tell me like a typical day.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I'll start with how I got there.
Yeah.
You know, I was in the, you know, like I mentioned earlier, I sort of transitioned into management consulting via the whole route of being, you know, focused on international HR. Stayed in that area, and I felt that, you know, it was a little volatile, especially in the federal practice, right? So there was a lot of things that were happening in the world of politics. And shifting of budgets and funds, and so we were constantly adjusting projects, and it also impacted sort of, you know, my role, right? So, and also just became a bit too sort of, for me, mundane, around the mill, right? And I said, I've got to get out of federal practice, and I want to do something back in the creative, and I want to do something that's in the commercial world. And I've always been interested in Sirius XM, but from the XM side, right? So it was a local company. I drove past it often, and it was always in the back of my head for probably the last, you know, prior to starting there, 10 years. I every so often looked on their job board to see if there was anything, and I finally was like, well, I'm out in the market now. Let's look, and they happened to have, a director role open, and immediately. I knew somebody who had worked there, sent, yes, that is exactly how my resume was noticed, because she had just left, but sent it to one of her HR contacts, who then forwarded it on to who became my boss, and I later found out after our first interview, she was like, oh, this is the one for me. But it took 3 months to get the offer.
Really?
It's a very slow sort of moving company. But after my first interview, I stopped looking. I know it's the worst thing to do, and I would never advise anybody who's looking for a job, just put all their eggs in one basket. But I was like, this is the place for me. I have to land this. And I started out supporting the content team, right? So our programming team, everybody that you listen to on our channels, and everybody who supports them. So that was a whole fascinating world for me. I've never, you know, and hugely different, coming from a very federally focused, conservative background, you know, ex-military types of individuals, to coming here and everybody's got purple hair and cut off jeans. And, so it was a little bit of an adjustment for me. And what I realized a few months after getting there, I was like, this is great, but it's not enough, right? It wasn't enough to keep me busy, because I kind of love the sort of the chaoticness, and I think I thrive more in a much faster when I'm busier. So I, you know, had a conversation with my boss, and I said, all right, this is great. I'm learning a lot. I know it's going to take me a lot longer to learn this business than I would have, you know, if transitioning back into the same world I knew, but I need something else. And we were just getting ready to kick off launching our SiriusXM app technology, I understand. So they're like, why don't you take that group? And that group just kept growing. And then we acquired Pandora, and I took that on, and and so now I am over the lead, I guess, for people for the entire technology organization. And the technology organization incorporates all of our digital products, the Sirius XM app, the Pandora app, and all of our products in the car, as well as your traditional IT world that you would think of, help desk networking.
Right.
And then on the other side of it is the broadcasting engineer. These are the people who make sure that our studios are running well and our satellites run well. So sort of the whole gamut of technology bundled up in one group.
I think one thing people don't realize when you're in the field of human resources, in terms of the business aspect, and I think you and I talked about this previously, which is the better you understand the business that you're supporting, the better advisor you can be, right? And we've, as someone who I think is a little older than you, I've seen the career progress such that you truly can be an advisor, you're a strategic partner. It's not so much what people think of as like behind the scenes, paper pushing HR people. And so to hear you talk about finding the niche for you in terms of your own ideology or where you could add the most value, I think is so important, right? And understanding that you could understand tech people and you did understand and you wanted more and more challenge, and being in the consulting professional services world, it is very high pace if you're used to that and wanting that same experience. So I think it's interesting that, like, from a business partner perspective, really understanding the business, knowing who you're working with, and being able to be a value add is super important. And I don't know that people outside of the world of HR really understand that effectively we're operating in business, just in a different way.
No, absolutely. Even today, if I say I'm in human resources, immediately it'll be like, hey, well, I have a cousin whose girlfriend's looking for a job. And they only associate with recruiting. And I don't do any of that. I mean, I partner with our recruiting team. And so when I try to explain what I do, it's like at the end of the day, the only word that comes up with is I'm a fixer.
Right.
Right? I mean, a lot of it is connecting the dots and, to your point, understanding the business to the point where you start to say, okay, how am I going to influence this? We've got an engagement issue here. We're forecasting this, and this is what's going to happen. We've got a shortage of of talent in this area. There's development issues. There's org development. There's a number of things. But if you don't understand what's happening day to day in the business, you can't connect those dots. Right. You can't help come in and fix things, right? So, yeah, it's truly important to know the business and have the and earn the respect of business leaders too. Because half the battle is you're put in that role. They also have to use you. They also have to partner with you and bring you to the table. And they're only going to do that if you can prove that you understand what they're dealing with and what they're working through. And
you've been there for I have two questions. So first, we'll start with the first one. In terms of being there for 5 years, right? That's a decent clip. What have you found that's helped you to be successful there, right? And what like when you got there and it was a little bit of a shock to the system in terms of culture being very different, how have you been able to sustain your own performance and then have staying power and have other opportunities?
REAL-ATABLE is sponsored by TFA Soft Skills, your one-stop shop for workshops, coaching, speaking, and soft skills development. If you'd like to hire Teresa, visit www.tfasoftskills.com for more information.
I think for me, it was always an interest in more. And so when I started, we didn't have a onboarding. It was still operating very much like a startup mentality. It's like, oh, everybody just come by, and I said, wait a minute. And I went to, our chief administrative officer, and I said, I think that we need an official onboarding. And it started with these things. Like every time I was like, I was focused enterprise-wise, right? Enterprise-wise.
Yes.
Get that word right?
Yeah.
I was focused more broadly than just doing my job. I immediately was like, okay, here's a gap. Here's where we can fill it. And I think that is what for me, helped me continue to grow,
Yeah.
helped me continue to actually learn the business and learn sort of all of the operations, because when I put that onboarding piece together, I had to understand everything from what happens when a person walks in the door, even before that, right? So it was
Your experience, right?
all
The
of
whole
that, yeah, the
experience,
entire experience of that employee's onboarding, I was able to document. That framework still exists 5 years later. Now, obviously, they continue to iterate and grow.
Right.
Now we have an entire employee experience team, which we didn't have. And so it continues to grow, but I think just having that like focus of like not just focused on my small little group and my world, it's like what else is happening? How else can I make this better? And I think that's and I still do that to this day.
Yeah, I think you mentioned something, the value out of trying to see where there's a gap, see where there's something that needs to be accomplished, and then taking an advantage of, here's how I can help fix that. It's so, excuse me, it's so, like I know I look for that, right, in people that work with me or the teams that I've worked with, like being able to anticipate that need and then deliver it on that, it's just, it then breeds more opportunity, for sure.
And I think I'm in an environment, right, I recognize that quickly enough, or at least maybe I forced it for myself, but in an environment where I created my own job, I created my own opportunities. And it was just me constantly pushing, and I know I have that reputation now of, well, let's go talk to Bhavna and see what she thinks, right?
That's good
But
though,
that
right?
is good, right? So being involved sort of at that angle is, I think for me, just, it's more fulfilling. I don't want to just check the box and go to work from 9 to 5, you know?
Right.
I want to make the improvements, I want to make it better, and for me, that's just...
What are some of the perks, right? If you get to work at like a cool place where there's interesting talent, do you have some cool perks, or has that been impacted by the pandemic?
It has slowed down.
Yeah.
But prior to that, access to concerts.
Yeah.
And I didn't actually take up,
Take
I'm not a big concert goer, but when there was somebody that I needed to see, I picked up the phone and I was like, okay. So Lady Gaga was the last concert I saw through Sirius XM, and it was very much, I need a ticket. And,
Make it happen.
Make it happen. And I mean, of course, and my boss was like, come on, and it was in New York, it was at the Apollo, it was a very intimate setting.
Ooh.
We do a lot of those where we'll have like concerts just for our listeners, and of course a lot of the employees go, not a lot, a decent amount of employees go, but it's really a listener appreciation. So they're super intimate, super small, and they're talking to us. They'll say, how are you doing in Sirius XM? And how are you doing that? And so you feel like, oh my gosh, they're performing for me.
Right.
So it was really, really cool. But I mean, when I go up to the New York office quite often, bumping into a celebrity happens. And, I'll tell you a funny story. I was there doing a very serious talent review. And I'm in meetings, and we're getting really into a particular person's sort of path, and we're stuck on like, these are all the amazing things they're good at, but here's what they need to work on.
Right.
And I get like texts are keep going. As I look at my phone, and my friends are like, Bhavna, Mimi's in the building, because they knew I was in New York.
Okay.
Mimi Mariah Carey was in the building with Andy Cohen, and I'm like, what am I supposed to go find?
There's been a sighting.
So it's just funny, like
Yeah.
you're in a meeting and like somebody walks by and you're like, oh, there's so and so.
I always felt like that because one of the 30 Rock is one of the buildings for where we used to work, and I was there all the time, and the Tonight Show and SNL are in that same building. And I was always, they keep like the elevator banks are different for those people, but a couple of times, I think we saw Carson Daly. Like there's definitely, you get some good traffic in there sometimes in terms of that. What about Howard Stern? Any dish, any scoop?
I supported the programming and
Right.
content group, but I never had sort of access to Howard.
Right.
Howard was very, very protected. He has his own very private studio. No one's allowed access in the private studio. He has his own elevator that he uses to get up. So no, very little. But I think that's fine, and because everybody wants to know, and I think that's how you contain sort of the rumor mill about everything.
And I think you had mentioned to me one time we were chatting about this that he surprisingly, not maybe surprisingly, but that off camera, sort of off air, like he's super, like he's almost genius about how he runs his business, right?
Yeah, he's
I
very
think that's
business-minded.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's obvious given how much success he's had, but
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think he demands a lot, but he takes care of his people and he takes care of his team from
Yeah.
what I hear. And it's that you immediately dismiss him when you see his on-air personality as some goofball.
Right,
But he's not.
right,
And
right.
you don't get this far in radio, first of all,
right.
to be this genius. And yeah, he runs his team really good.
Yeah. Tell me about just in terms of your earlier life, right? So one of the things that I like to chat with people about are just any events or situations that shaped how you have proceeded through your own, like we talked about you starting in college and how you navigated to this career, but was there anything in terms of your young adult life or any a situation or occurrence or people that impacted you in a way that changed the course of your life, or anything that you had to kind of work through that was a challenge or difficult?
Oh my gosh. I mean, to be personal,
Yeah.
I think for me, the challenging thing was being diagnosed with depression and anxiety. I never knew what was wrong with me, if you will, right? And never got diagnosed with that as a child. My parents, again, being from a culture that doesn't or didn't really recognize mental health, always just sort of like narrated my behavior as, oh, she's just a wild child. You know, just one of
Or
those
dramatic,
or dramatic, or
Right.
moody, or
Right.
you know, it was always just categorized as like just her being her, and it wasn't. It was angst. It was other things. It was whatever. But got to college and I had a pretty serious like episode, and I went to the school psychologist, and I think that's where I was starting to like understand that this was more than just me being moody or you know.
Right.
Just learning to deal with that. My first job, I was working full time, going to grad school full time. The pressure was on. It was
Right.
a lot, and I had a huge sort of breakdown at work, and again, I'm an advocate of like EAP and all this.
Right.
I didn't really know what any of that meant.
Right. EAP is employee
Employee
assistance.
assistance program,
Yeah.
and they offer a lot of
Support,
options and
yeah.
support and therapy sessions, counseling sessions being one of them. So a colleague of mine found me under my desk. But I didn't even know what was. I was having a panic attack. I didn't know what was happening, and I was under my desk and hyperventilating. And cut to they called the EAP, and I kept saying, "No, I'm fine." Of course, I wasn't fine.
Right. Right.
And they put me on, and I think for me that was so sort of impactful. And now when I, talk to people and counsel people, it's I push it, and I always let them know that I've used it. It works for me, kind
Right.
of deal. But having said all that, I think it was my challenge to being able to balance that and balance all of those sort of emotions and figuring all of that out, kind of on my own, and not letting it show up at work. I felt really weak when that first happened. So for me
Right.
to constantly be seen as like put together and
Interesting.
I got it, and nobody cries at work, and I'm strong. And also being a female, you have a lot of other connotations associated
Yeah.
with it. So it's that constant struggle and I feel like some of that made me be more restrictive in how I showed up.
Mm-hmm.
But, you live through it.
How would you say, because it was undiagnosed for so long, like if for people that are listening, how would you say some of those symptoms showed up without you knowing what was going on, right? Were you tired? Were you less engaged? Was the anxiety more like, was it physical? Was it more mental? Like, how did it show up for you before you figured out what it was?
Really good question. Withdrawn.
Mm.
I often heard things or comments from from my friends in college. Oh, you think you're too good to hang out with us, and it wasn't so much of me not hanging out with them because I thought I was too good to hang out with them. I was a hot mess. So
yeah.
I would just withdraw. I'm an introvert by nature to begin with, and so going back within was the only way I knew how to sort of deal with it. I got into a weird pattern of staying up all night and, working through whatever I was going through, my schooling and reading, writing, and then sleeping all day, missing classes. But also being a poli-sci major, I could do that, right? I mean, all I had to do was read a stack of books this high, and I could do that on my own. I didn't have to go. So I used a lot of tools that I just picked up that were survival mechanisms.
Right.
And one of them was just kind of deep diving into things that, kept me busy. And
You alluded to this a little bit. I'm curious about, being a woman, right, in terms of your career and how you've had to navigate that, but also in terms of, your demographics and your race. So I'm curious for you how that has served you well or how that's been a challenge. And maybe we could talk a little bit about that.
yeah, no, I think that was always, and in many ways it still somewhat comes up a little,
Mm-hmm.
but very self-conscious about both of those things, but more so being South Asian, right? I think in my career, I didn't see very many South Asians, and especially not in HR. So with my colleagues, I was always the outsider. That's how I felt. I don't think they saw that, but that's how I always felt. And so for me, yeah, it always was a top of mind. My first leadership position I was at USA Weekend Magazine under USA Today, and I am the head of HR sitting at a table of mainly all white men in their 50s. And I just turned 30 years old. And I just felt like such a fraud. I'm like, first of all, how dare I?
Right.
Why am I here? Why did they even hire me? What is happening? And then constantly feeling self-conscious about my ideas. They were good. Now that I look back and I'm like, I had good ideas. I had good thoughts, and I was too afraid to communicate them. I was too afraid to bring them up. Or if I did it in a way where it was a little too apologetic or too unsure, and I didn't have that conviction. And it was constantly this reminder of like, A, why are you here? You're too young, or you're a woman, or you're Asian. I think that always stuck in my head.
And how do you feel like, are you past that? Is that still for you something that you have to consciously address in a way to talk yourself out of it? Or have you seen the environment around you progress? Or is it a little bit of both?
I think that I have matured and I have a lot more confidence in myself. And in a way the environment has matured. But just last week, I had a call with two male leaders where they were talking over me. But the old me might have handled it differently. The me that I am today was like, excuse me, let me finish my thought, right? And they're like, oh yes, of course, right? But so does it still happen? Yes, I think there are times, but I'm handling it differently, and I don't let it sort of shatter my confidence.
It's fascinating. We talked about this with another guest where she talked about being in a room. She was FBI, and she was talking about how she had ideas and thoughts and would wait, and other people would communicate those same thoughts, and she would think, "Why? Like that's what I was thinking." But just because of that, whatever that. It's so hard to articulate what that is because it's a most people would say, well, you're just making a choice not to communicate that. Like that's kind of on you. It's not the environment. But I think it's a confidence thing, but it's also once you do it and you have success, and I think this is probably any gender or race, right? Like once you do something, you have success, you can do it again, but there's a construct that makes that more challenging. Yeah. And then it's just this domino effect, right, of being able to do that. So it's so interesting that you say that you're able now to, in the moment, when you have something to say, and similarly, I'm in an organization where we've got where I do a lot of consulting, where there's very senior people and there's more junior people, and having, for the less experienced people, permission to try to get the word in, right? Because people talk over each other, and the more senior people, and they tend to have the floor, right? So how do you create an environment where you have permission to do that. And then two, like taking a moment and being able to assert yourself in an appropriate way that is like appropriate for this conversation, right, and the business that you're in.
So interesting, because I think that awareness is such a huge understanding the imbalance.
Right.
If you've never had to feel that way,
Right.
you don't know there's an imbalance,
Right.
and you are naturally going to think it is a choice. You chose not to speak up. You can. I do it, right? But I think the all of this training and that we're doing now associated with D&I and equity is helping to sort of raise people's like awareness around that imbalance in that room and sort of that engagement, right? It's like inclusion isn't just like being in the room. It's like, okay, let's reach out. Let's kind of be observant of what's happening and be a little bit more attuned. I have always had made a practice of tapping into our younger people in the room, right, on the team, and so the conversation is just not dominated by a bunch of senior folks. We're just like, the reason we have diversity of age group and thought, I mean, it's just to have different ideas, right? So I think that for me, and anyone sort of more, in a senior role, is to kind of look at the room and bring somebody out, right? So what do you think, so-and-so, and what do you think, right? What are your thoughts about that? I think that's helpful, but I do see young people actually have a lot of confidence in themselves today. And it's not where, when I was starting out, we were a little bit more timid and maybe waited to be invited in the conversation.
Right.
I am at least seeing from, in the groups that I support, they're very confident. And so I'm picking up from that as well. I think part of my sort of education and confidence building was to see like, well, look at them. Look how they're sort of operating and they're comfortable operating in this environment. So, yeah, I mean, it's a combination of just, I think, people bringing in, having that awareness about being engaged versus, not, and you can have exclusion in those situations.
For sure, and I think that's such a great point about drawing it out and being observant, right? And anyone can do that. It's not only for those that are in a anointed leadership position, right? Anyone can do that. I think the other thing that you mentioned, while maybe those that are a different generation or generations that are coming after us, what I've noticed is while there is more comfort, the art of influence and the art of how you do that is where there's some gaps. Yeah. And this gets to the whole soft skills thing that I'm so passionate about. But being able to collaborate and influence in a way that gets you the outcome versus this is my opinion and this is what I think and this is what I want, right? Like there's an art form to it that I think takes time to establish that.
I agree, and I think for me, one of the soft skills that I'm very passionate about is language. Words are so important, and I think it was more important to me being an immigrant. I came here when I was 5 years old, and I, already knew, and when you're young, it's more important, right? I already knew I didn't look like everyone else. I was hell-bent on making sure I sounded like everyone else. So language was so important to me, and saying things the right way, and not ever being made fun of if I didn't say it the right way. So I focused so much on how to articulate, focused so much on how to sort of say things, kind of bubble things down in a very succinct way. And so for me, I think one of the soft skills that I see that are lacking, kind of to what you were saying, are the ability to like really articulate yourself. Yes, there are people who are more comfortable in sharing, but how you say things is also important. I often have young people who want to talk to me about career progression and their development, and again, succinctly being able to say, what is it that you want? What is it that you want to do? And where do you feel like you fit into the organization? Just having that awareness. It's coming to me and they'll go, oh, well, I've been doing this job for a long time. Okay, well, what are you interested in? I'm not sure. I don't know is not an answer. So let's talk through some of that, and I ask a lot of questions. But anyways, to me, I think that is such an important soft skill. Is being able to really know what you're thinking and how to articulate it.
You said something that's interesting about, and I want to come back to the soft skills for sure, but in terms of you coming at 5 and then being almost the blending, like wanting to blend and not stand out based on being different.
Yeah.
And we've had some other conversations with people of color, and so I'm curious for you, how much now that where you are in your life, like how much do you feel like you had to divorce yourself from your culture and where you're from to blend, right? To that sort of extent that then it's not an issue versus owning that and being proud of it. And then I'm thinking too with your family, right? Because that family culture, like is it this weird like balancing act between fitting into this culture and blending so that you can succeed here versus kind of, betraying is maybe too strong of a word, but do you feel like you have to be one or the other, or has it been this thing over time that you've been able to work out?
It's a journey.
Yeah.
It was immediately a sort of no. I don't want any part of it.
Right.
I don't want to speak the language. I don't want to look different in any way, shape, or form.
If you'd like to advertise with REAL-ATABLE, please email us at info@tfasoftskills.com for more information.
And that actually was a sentimentality that I had like through, grade school, through high school. I remember we were in the, at the mall or something with my mom, and my mom was speaking to me in Hindi, and I was like, Mom, speak English, And I was so embarrassed, right? You go through that, and because acceptance is so important for a young person.
Mm-hmm.
We get to college, and it was the first time that I saw so much pride in people for being who they are.
Where they came from.
Right, their heritage and their culture. And I just, the first 2 years I was a little bit unsure.
Mm-hmm.
I made a lot of friends that were South Asian, but I was still very much like, I'm not sure if I fit in 100%.
Right.
And I think cut two, I'm at a point where I think it's so cool that I know another language, two other languages. I think it's so cool that I have a different, sort of cultural awareness and all these things that I bring. I think are assets now that were things that I thought were the most hideous and embarrassing before. But to me, also being so, ambitious about my career was another area that I felt that might have been betrayal, right? So my mom comes from a very, very small town in India, very parochial, and it was important. Education was important, but it was like more important, great, you had a degree, but you need to get married, and you need to settle down, and you need to have family, it was a lot of that, and those weren't things that I was focusing on, and I think there was this constant sort of battle at home about, what my ambitions were and what I wanted to do versus what the expectation was of my family, of society, at least in that generation. And I say generation because I do think that mentality has very much shifted. My sister's raising children, and she's not raising children in that way at all, right? So I think that sort of the first generation of parents coming in were, in the 70s and 80s were still holding on to a lot of those older values, but it's shifting along the way.
That's something you and I chat about that maybe if you'd be willing to talk about here too, in terms of not being married and not having kids, right? And how that's impacted your relationships either with other women or with coworkers. Like, do you feel like there's pressure still to be like, who are you dating? When are you having kids? Like, does that ever go away? Or do you feel like at this point, that's better? Or I don't even know if that's the right term.
Well, now come to think of it, I don't think anyone's asked me in a long time about when I'm having children, and maybe that's because I'm starting to look old. I know, like, that ship has sailed for her. No, but yes, I think that is always a thing. It's like, they assume it's a we, often, right? And I'll say, oh, I'm going on vacation, or most times I'm with friends, but they naturally assume that there is a we, and, I'm a confident, happy, single person, right. And so It is definitely interesting culturally, but I know it's funny. I read a lot of articles about that. There are far more women that, especially in the city, right, in Washington D.C., that are accomplished, single, buying homes, making big purchases, going on vacation. So I think the mood's shifting in that way. But boy, let me tell you, there was always and the worst question isn't why don't you have a boyfriend? It's kind of like, what's wrong with you?
Like it implied.
That there was you were damaged or there's something wrong with you. Otherwise, why would you be single?
Right.
It's just the worst.
Yeah, that's very frustrating. And I feel like, I hope we're getting better at that. And I think you see a lot now of people that are, on their own deciding whether they want to parent, right? And just do it themselves. Or one of the things that we talked about before that I loved, you had mentioned, taking trips by yourself. You've decided, there's a place you want to go, you're going to take that trip. And that's I think that is so adventurous in terms of being able to kind of be on your own and forge a path. That's got to feel help with your own confidence and independence too.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I first started traveling on my own when I was in grad school, and it was another episodal issue. I think it was related to the one I was telling you about in terms of timing. Now that I'm thinking about it, but it was I told you I pulled away.
Right.
So I was turning 25 and I wanted to go to Italy. So I was going to Italy, but I was going through this group through a university because they were focusing on art and studying art for 2 weeks. And I was I'm going to tag along with them. And when I told my mother, I was going overseas by myself, it was kind of no.
Right.
And everything was always hinged on, you can do all the traveling you want when you're married, and as if my husband was going to take care of all that stuff and I can, be protected or something. I went anyways, and I went alone and ended up making lifelong friends, and it was so fascinating and so much fun, and it was great, but that was the spark that for me for traveling alone, being adventurous, and never stopped.
So one of the things I said I had to share on this podcast is this wonderful story that when you and I were and this is the segue for me is that I do think you have a great spirit about you and a very you'll kind of you'll roll with it, right? And you're a lot of fun to be with, right? The outside of sort of the context of being very smart and accomplished. And so we were at this wedding. And you and I knew each other fairly well, but I don't think we had spent a lot of time socializing outside of work, right? So we're at this wedding, and we're having a great time. And you had brought your date, who was a blast, it was a really good friend of yours, right? Yeah. And then my husband and I somehow we ended up, I think, at the same table, and then we were all dancing. And you had this gorgeous, beautiful, stunning white dress that had a nice, huge gold zipper up the front.
Front and back.
It was front and back, yeah. And it was very well fitted, right? And so we were all laughing. Maybe there was some liquid courage that was involved. And so we're dancing, we're having a great time, and you were standing right in front of me, and there was just in that moment there was something. The zipper had a big gold circle on it, and I was joking, and I went to pretend to pull the zipper, and I actually pulled the zipper, and it came down to here, and your reaction was oh my god, and my husband just left the scene, immediately was I have no part in this. He was totally mortified, humiliated. And you handled it such a pro, your ability, this is one of the things I love about people that draws me to people is when you can laugh at yourself, right? I feel that's how I've made a lot of friends, that's how I've maintained a decent network, is to have a sense of humor. You have such a good sense of humor about it, you're so cool about it. I think we laughed all night about it, right? And to this day, whenever we talk, I think about that story, I think about how just again, how great you handled that situation. Do you remember it?
Oh yeah. I mean, and there was a lot of wine to be had. But yes, I do recall, and I just remember it was so funny because I don't think anyone ever really thinks it's a real zipper. That dress is caused a lot of commotion.
Really?
I wore it 2 or 3 times. The wedding was one, and I wore it another time, and it elicited a lot of.
It's like a magic dress.
It did. I remember it was a friend of mine, my dearest friend, got married in Telluride, and I officiated their wedding.
Oh, nice.
And yeah, it was so beautiful up on the roof, and I mean, I'm up on a mountain. We climbed and hiked, and as anyways, we got back to DC, and there was a big sort of party for them, and I had that dress on, and one of their friends, lawyer, worked on the Hill, walks in, and immediately was like, said something so appropriate, like, I want to just put my teeth on that zipper and pull it all the way down or something like that. And we instantly just became friends. It was so great.
It's a gateway. The dress is a gateway to friendships, to lifelong relationships.
Inappropriateness, but yes, it's a collective.
That's fantastic. All right. A couple of other things, totally bizarre segue. Tell me a little bit about, for you, in your own path, what are some of the areas of development that you've worked on that you have found, you know, we've all got our strengths and then we've got things that we're working on. So maybe just, if you would, talk a little bit about that in terms of how you've handled that, right? If someone's come to you with an opportunity for your growth and development, and is there been like a constant theme for you that's something that you, like mine is detail oriented, right? I'm definitely with the details. I've worked very hard to like be better at that, but over time, I used to be like ashamed of it, and it was like, if you're not detail oriented, that means you're not as smart as the next person in the room, right? So that's just my thing, that I have to, you know, I'm very big picture oriented, and you know, I'm a creative thinker, and so you learn to kind of embrace the things that you have, but also there's definitely things that you work on that help to create that holistic package. Yeah. What's been something for you that you've been able to address or work on, or that's been, you know, I think that's helpful for people to hear about, that, you know, in terms of how other people work through those challenges?
So I would say 2 things. One is just kind of an interesting sort of observation of myself, but it has come back as feedback, right? One is, to me, I'm not one of those people that has to be in a meeting and has to say something. If the conversation is going and someone else has already made that comment or thought, I don't feel the need to repeat it, or, you know, I'm listening, but I'll chime in when something hasn't been said. And that can be interpreted as you're either not engaged or you don't know, you're not sure, you're unsure, you know. And so I have to constantly remind myself, everything is on, you're always on display, no matter where you are. So you always have to remind myself to plug in. I mean, to even if I have to repeat it, just so people are aware, know, you know. But to me, it was like, it's the obvious. Like, I don't have to keep piling on. I don't have to chime in. But in many ways, you kind of do. Because people are still watching, right?
Right.
So it comes back in so many forms as feedback, but so that's one. And the other one was, I mentioned earlier, where I was so focused on sounding proper or sounding a certain way that one of my sort of development areas that I need to work on is being able to speak off the cuff, right? When I'm addressing teams or addressing a large audience, for me, I have to prepare. I have to take, I have to write sort of bulleted notes because I want to make sure I say everything right. And sometimes you can just wing it. Sometimes you can just go up and but there's that level of sort of, am I saying it the wrong way? And so I've come a long way from it. I'm a lot more comfortable just, going up and winging it and knowing that I'm confident enough to speak on a topic. But, there's just always been this public speaking sort of fear, because not so much fear of the people, but fear of like not saying the right
having the right word at the right time.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you get to a point as you age around the 80-20, or 80% is good enough. And I think when you're trying, as we did, and you alluded to this, and I think it's the same way, I don't know if it was so much gender specific or just working in an environment that was very high stakes, high pressure, a lot of really talented people, and wanting to feel like you're at the same level, you're competing at this, competing is a strong word, but that you're able to deliver, right?
In many environments at work, you are competing.
Right, and the idea that if you're not perfect, then you can't progress, and I think that is a huge fallacy, actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
And being able to be that 80% allows you to move quicker. It allows you to be more, I think, open to like what's happening in the moment, right? All the things that you just mentioned. So I feel like I appreciate you being open and vulnerable about that, and that there continue to be things that you're kind of working on.
Absolutely, we're not robots, we're not perfect.
Right, for sure. So along those lines, I just have a couple of questions left. One is around your own, like when you think back to, you shared so much about your own personal journey as well as your professional journey. I'm curious if you were to give coaching to young Bhavna, right? The Bhavna that was maybe high school age, or when you're just sort of coming out of college, and now you have this breadth of experience behind you. What counsel or what would you tell her that might make the road a little bit easier?
Wow.
Or how she could maybe navigate it with a little less agita.
Yeah. I think learning vulnerability early on, and not seeing things as a weakness immediately. Because when you see things as a weakness, you start to overcompensate. And the overcompensating can come across in many ways. For me, it came across as arrogance. Everything that was happening inside was completely the opposite of arrogance. But being vulnerable, being able to actually say things like, I'm not sure, and I don't know, and not always having the right answers, not always trying to be perfect. And I think I talked about that earlier, was always showing up perfect, can be a detriment. Because again, if you're not in that moment, and you're not sure in that moment, there's so many other signals you might be giving that are not accurate to who you are, or misrepresenting you. So I think just learning vulnerability. Now I'm the first person to say, well, I don't know what I'm doing, or even today I'm I don't know how to handle this, and I need to step back from it, and maybe walk around and come back and revisit it after a couple of meetings or whatever, right? So I'm able to recognize that right away, and ask for help. Right.
Yeah, asking for help is so huge. Do you think you knew it came across as arrogance? Were you even?
No, I wasn't aware.
It didn't even. So that's a great read. That's a great piece of advice for people that may be interpreting other people's behavior as arrogant when maybe there's all these
other
other things going on, right?
That I was putting up, and so it took me a long time to understand. I kept thinking, why am I so misunderstood? Right? What is happening? And then you have to really start to kind of examine yourself and say, okay, that time I was misunderstood. What was happening?
Right.
What did I say? What did I do? It was a lot of that introspective. So learning that is really eye-opening.
It is, and I think especially for the less experienced, or even when you are in high school or college, the idea of you're trying to put your best self forward, but it almost becomes to the detriment of being real. Mm-hmm. And now with everything they have around social media and everything else, it's almost like that real factor of stay connected to that real part of yourself, and where you can and where it feels okay and safe, because I know it's a scary time, really can't be totally vulnerable and out there all the time, but pushing yourself to do it and being more confident in who you are, or feeling more settled than trying to be someone else, right? It helps a lot.
Yeah.
All right, on the soft skills side, you talked about language. I think you have a unique perspective given your role, and you're looking at a lot of talent and you're evaluating a lot of talent. So you mentioned the importance of language, which I think is also super important, and the intention of language and how you use it. What else do you see in terms of gaps, or that you see are critical areas that people that are emerging talent, they're trying to progress their career in terms of the soft skills space around, like I had mentioned before, influence, collaboration, communication, verbal, nonverbal, teaming, those areas. What would you say is top of your mind right now when you're working with talent?
I think
for people to focus and develop.
Yeah, I think if you are interest in leadership.
Mhm.
Where I see some leaders kind of fall flat or struggle is with empathy and like having EQ.
Mhm.
You know, just having that sort of people focus, people aspect of things. That is, you know, it's easy. I mean, to me, again, when I was younger, I thought that was a weakness, and it's not. Right?
Right.
It's a strength, and it's such a strength. And you can be a very powerful, influential leader, and have the EQ to recognize how to behave, how to pick things up, how to understand the nuances of a team or a group. Be sensitive to sort of, you know, understanding, you know, sort of your backgrounds, to be, you know, sensitive to sort of how you got there or how to manage you, right? To be situational around
Right.
it. So I think that to me is like a huge area.
And do you find, this is what I'm curious about your perspective, and we ran into it a lot, or I did anyway, in the professional services world, like if you're really good in your area of expertise, and you're somebody in the consulting world that is a rainmaker and can sell, right, and have accounts that do well, you're applauded for that, you're rewarded for that, you're incentivized to that, and so there isn't as much of an expectation to develop and deliver on the EQ side, right? And then it becomes, not always, but it can become problematic, and then it's all about mitigation and coaching, right? So it's so important that I think even if you are very strong in whatever discipline you're seeking, that you take care and time to develop that other side, because that just makes you more impactful, more productive. Like, I don't think people realize how much it ties to overall performance.
Absolutely, and I also think those people who don't show it, they have it because they're able to sell. So how do you sell, right? You're able to relate to people. So you choose sometimes often enough, you know,
Yes.
than to display it all the time. And again, if you go back to things where I was talking about maybe show to them if they think it's sweetness, right?
Yeah.
The other thing is for leaders to recognize what your gaps are and to hire for those gaps. Don't hire everybody that's like you, because then you're just perpetuating whatever those areas and gaps are, but hire to those gaps. So being aware of your own sort of, you know, strengths, but also being aware of like areas that you may not be that strong, and surrounding yourself with a team that can help sort of build that up.
Right, yeah. Thank you so much. This was a blast. I really appreciate you being here. I feel like you had so many great nuggets and words of wisdom, and I'm so happy, you know, we've been trying to have this conversation for a while, so I really appreciate it, and wish you nothing but success as you continue to soar in your HR career. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
Thank you, Bhavna, for your vulnerability and candor throughout this conversation. It's so appreciated. Sharing your diagnosis of depression and how that impacted you, both socially, academically, and professionally, and what you've done about that, and what you've done to overcome that. Your honesty about your development areas in terms of learning to speak up when you're someone who's more inclined to listen and observe, and how sharing your opinion is really important. And I also really loved your comments about being vulnerable and how sharing that vulnerability is really important, and that sometimes when you don't, or if you have walls up, that can come off as being arrogant or as too much ego, when that's really not the case. I also want to thank Missy, our producer for Relatable, and a quick shout out to Hannah, who recently joined our team and is helping us with the podcast. Thank our Relatable community. As a reminder, if you would like to subscribe, you can find us on YouTube or your favorite streaming platform. You can also find more information about Relatable and our sponsor TFA Soft Skills at www.tfasoftskills.com. Until next time, this is Teresa Freeman with Relatable. Stay connected.